Looking ahead, challenges and opportunities in the changing world. Welcome to Talking Economics, podcast launched on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, Economics Institute. How has the current pandemic affected measuring poverty and evaluating welfare programs? My name is Katarína Stehlíková, and in today's podcast, we will take a closer look at these and other questions with my guest, Nikolas Mittag. Nikolas has been an associate professor with tenure at CERGE-EI, an associate professor at CERGE, Charles University, and a researcher at the Economics Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences. He is also affiliated under the Institute for the Study of Labor and the University of Chicago. He received his PhD in Public Policy Studies from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. His main research interest is in evaluation of government programs, applied microeconomics, labor economics, and measurement error issues. Welcome, Nikolas.
Thanks. Look forward to talking.
Well, the list of your research interests is, rather long and extensive. So I suggest we start with a brief description of what your research is focused on currently.
Well, as you can see from the long list, maybe it's not that focused because it focuses on things I'm interested in. But I think for the purpose of talking today, the part of my work that's relevant is on measuring and evaluating government programs. I work on a very specific aspect of it, which is how can we use existing survey data, how can we combine it with administrative data to better measure what these programs do, how they work, given the fact that we often rely on survey data alone, and people are often reluctant or unable to report the government aid that they get.
Mm-hmm. This seems very well aligned or very relevant for the situation during and after the pandemic, right? Because the government programs were a key component, I would say, of saving the situation. So what would you like to say regarding the COVID and the government aid?
Well, COVID primarily was a health shock, right? So the main strain was on the health sector, which is a public program, but one that I don't work much on. I work more on government transfer programs and welfare programs, which of course bore the brunt of the response to the health crisis, right? We essentially shut down public life for a while. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people lost income. So that's what the government safety net is designed to work on. And if you get a large shock to that, of course, it moves into focus, right? We had a lot of discussion about what the government should do, what it can do, how it should do it. And these happen to be the question that beforehand we thought about alone in our office, and now they were much more in public focus because a lot of more people needed help.
Mm-hmm. And from your perspective, from the perspective of public economics, can you say what are the main, or what were the main tools the governments used? Maybe use your experience from the US.
Well, there were lots of tools. So let me first clarify that I work on income and monetary transfers, which of course were just one way hardship hit people in the pandemic, right? Staying at home, child services were disrupted. There were lots of mental health problems, right? We need to deal with these. So I deal with income, and I think there are two parts to it. One is you have a safety net in place, and that gets a much larger shock than usual. Right now, it's not only one person who loses their job, but a lot of people, and different people than before, and different people being in temporary unemployment. So one component you can rely on is the existing safety net and how it expands. You could see that in the US very well, where the unemployment insurance system acted as one of the major things to fend off drops in income. I think we've had an increase in unemployment insurance claim within a week that was far beyond anything we've ever seen in the US ever since the program started, and we still continue to highly rely on it. But even if you just look at unemployment insurance, you can see that it wasn't enough to catch this type of shock. The government immediately expanded the existing program, unemployment insurance, more benefits, made more people eligible, in order to catch a much larger shock than we've ever seen. So that's a second way in which the government can act. It can expand existing programs. So that has the big advantage that you have a program in place. It's easy to administer, right? You have this infrastructure, people know about it, so you can easily add on to that. And my understanding is that the response of unemployment insurance, while it had some glitches, was overall very successful. I think there's evidence that within a few months, almost everyone who was looking for work and needed help received unemployment insurance benefits in the US. It varied a bit by state. Some were better, some were worse. It took a while in the initial month of the pandemic to process everything. But including the expansion, it seems to have been very, very successful. Now, a third way you can react, and you probably should react, is by immediate emergency relief. And that's where a lot of the discussion came about. What should the government actively do? This was a new type of crisis. It's a much bigger crisis than we've seen before. So that raises the question whether the response should be bigger than what the safety net usually responded. And we've seen that as well in the US with the economic impact payments. I think here we had a couple of new programs, such as the Kurzarbeit program or immediate relief. So that's direct government action to fend off things that you think the safety net didn't catch well.
Part of what you mentioned is the Kurzarbeit, and one of the main arguments I think for that here, and it was a new thing here, was that it will prevent actually people from becoming unemployed, right? It will prevent them from losing their jobs, so kind of preventing the use of the standard safety net and the unemployment benefits. And arguing was that we want to preserve the relationships between the employers and the employees and the human capital. So can you comment on that? Whether you think, what are the benefits, or why wasn't it applied in the US?
So let me start with a complicated question, which is why wasn't it applied in the US? And particularly since we've seen that it was a very successful tool in the previous crisis in Europe. I can't really answer that. My guess is that that's by and large something between cultural and labor market differences. The US has a culture where you can lay people off and rehire them. People go on unemployment insurance for short spells and then often come back to the same employer. And then you might not need Kurzarbeit as much, right? As you said, or you mentioned one advantage of Kurzarbeit, which is it preserves employer-employee relationships. And these can be costly to reset up, right, to find a new employer, to rehire people. So if it's easier to rehire people, then you might not, or then Kurzarbeit loses one of its main attractions. The other key advantage of Kurzarbeit, I think, in this situation, which would apply to the US as well, is that contrary to unemployment insurance, people continue to work. So if you want to keep some economic activity alive, then it makes sense to keep these people on Kurzarbeit rather than have them go on unemployment insurance. And I think particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, when we were all hoping that it wouldn't last for 2 years or more, was both to preserve these ties and to keep people in work, to keep them in employment and to keep them in work. So I think it's a very useful tool. I'm very glad we introduced it. At the same time, I think it highlights what economic research can achieve for you, can help you with, and that's the design of these programs. And I think with Kurzarbeit, as good as it is, and I'm not trying to say it would be better if we didn't have it, but I think it would be better if we had designed it better. So let me give you two examples of how you should watch both just basic economic insights and the empirical evidence we have on existing government programs. So in terms of simple economic insights, what we just said was the idea is to keep people in employment relationships so that it's easier for them to go back to the same job after the crisis is done, right? That would facilitate the economy picking up again. That would make it less costly for people to find new jobs, right? But that only makes sense if after the crisis you actually go back to the same job. If you do not go back to the same job, or if you would not go back to the same job regardless of Kurzarbeit, then it can actually be damaging. You might keep a job where you shouldn't be. That's not useful to you and the employer for a while. So you kind of continue working on that instead of getting new skills, finding a new job, looking for something new, right? So what you want to do is you want the program to be structured in a way that both the employer and the employee think about whether it's worth it for them to get back together again. You can do simple things like make companies pay part of it if they use it. That would make them think, do I really want to invest this small amount? Because I think we'll get back together again and then that'll be easier.
It's worth it.
Rather than just have a blanket program that you can get anyway. Right? And I think that way we could have preserved more jobs that would resume. And on the other hand, pushed more people to unemployment insurance and thereby looking for new jobs, looking for new things to do, who would not get back together again. There's an open question whether that actually was a problem or whether that actually is a problem, right? It might really hinder the pickup of the economy if you're stuck in essentially bad employment relationships because of habit, right? At the moment, I think what we see is that some sectors have a shortage of workers and other sectors still need help, still have excess employment relationships. So that may have many, many, many reasons, but it is consistent with the idea that maybe we overdid it. Maybe more people should have looked for new jobs and others should have been preserved.
The question is, as you said, there is also one of the big issues where the mental health issues, and there is so much uncertainty now that this would add additional stressor factor to people here, that you are losing your job. So maybe this was helping on this front. In the US, as you say, people are more used to going and more used to the flexible job market, labor market. Here, I think it's more about the certainty and...
No, sure. There's some value to certainty and to doing that. There's a question whether, and I think there you're right. There's a question whether, if you stay in your employment relationship just to lose it at the end of the crisis in a bad economy, whether that's better. I tend to agree with you that maybe we have enough to worry about now and can worry about that later. But it does present a significant threat to the take-up of the economy after the crisis if we get people stuck in the employment they had, right? Maybe a simpler example of how we can think about simple economic incentives and what they do is the question of how much work incentives you provide within Kurzarbeit. The program we implemented here had no incentives for you to work. If part of the point is to keep you working, as much as it makes sense, as much as you can, right? Both for your mental health, probably, that's probably good. And also for the economy, that's probably good if we keep more people working. Then you could have easily made the replacement rate, meaning the fraction of of your wage that the government pays for you, increase in the number of hours you work. So that if you work very little, you're pretty much doing the same as if you were on UI. Whereas if you work more, you get more and more and more replaced of your salary, which is better for your employer and better for you, most likely. And at the same time, it would have kept you working more. So this is a simple incentive on how to structure a government program that, to my knowledge, is not reflected in the implementation of the program. I'm not saying that the program is bad, right? I'm trying to say the program could have probably been better, and we should have looked at all kinds of factors that influence it. We could have looked at what's the mental health cost of losing jobs versus keeping them, right? Who loses their job? Who would relocate? Is that feasible, right? We could have looked at all these things and incorporated them.
Maybe this is one of the opportunities presented by the pandemic, because as you were saying, in the US, they were relying on the existing safety net and existing programs. And this Kurzarbeit, which was newly introduced here relatively quickly, right, because the pandemic was a huge shock, and at the beginning it was the strongest. It's now being considered, or was considered, for becoming a standard tool that would kick in always if in case of some sort of disaster in a way, or troubles. So it's an opportunity for economists to advise on how these programs can be designed, right? And what are the important features to be taken into account. One of the issues with the programs here was the bureaucracy, right? That many programs requested a lot of paperwork, which was daunting, and people then either were not successful or were not even interested in applying because it was too complicated. What does an economist say on that?
Well, it's a problem we've looked at since forever, right? Do people actually get a program once you do it? I think as the government, you should lay out rules on who should be supported. And then the people who are eligible, you want them to actually get the program. And we've known since forever that that's not how it works in practice. There are lots of problems of getting bureaucracy. I think the other part that's very important is information about the program, right? You really had to follow the government programs in order to understand what you were eligible for, what you could get, right? And I can tell you, I didn't. No, I didn't need any help, so maybe that's good. But those are two key problems, right? Do you know about the program? And then if you know about the program and you should be eligible, can you actually get it? And these were vastly amplified by the pandemic, right? Information is harder to come by because you have less social interactions. There were new programs, so less information was around about them, but also the implementation and the bureaucracy. Not only were there many more people who requested help, so that overwhelmed agencies, right? But also we needed to deliver it much quicker than usual. Well, actually, that's an interesting question, whether we needed to deliver it more quickly or whether that came into focus now, right? All the people that were waiting for help from the government now, isn't someone in a normal situation when they lose their job in a similar situation? Isn't that just as bad? It's just not as many. It's just not you and me who get these types of problems. So I think an aspect of it that it did was it shed a lot of light on problems that people had all the time, that you and I probably just weren't as aware of. At the same time, of course, the problems were very different from what we knew in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of it being overwhelmed. But you could see here that I think, as far as I know, you might know better than I do. Some of these early programs, they were not taken up at all, and that's of course a problem, right? If you design a program and you want to help someone and then it just doesn't work, that's a problem. It might be even worse that it goes to the wrong people. Right, you can think about a simple case where many of these programs were very bureaucratic. If you're trying to work and, I don't know, support 2 kids, do you have the time to actually do that? And maybe the person who's less in need of help actually manages more. So a layer of bureaucracy induces a margin of selection of who gets the program. Exactly. That I think we do not want. Of course, you have the flip side of it. If you look at the US, for example, part of the response was in introducing new programs in UI, but part was also essentially a blanket income transfer. I'm not sure why I should get a check from the US government. I didn't lose my job. I didn't have a dip in income. In fact, I wasn't able to spend as much as I usually would. So why does the U.S. government send me a check? Right. So the flip side of having a program that does not include many eligibility criteria is that it's too broad. It's inefficient. You might argue that that's still better than missing people that need help. But I think there's middle ground where you set eligibility criteria that are very simple to check, that are very simple to implement, that maybe can be assessed ex post, and design programs in a way they're self-targeting. What I said about Kurzarbeit imposing some cost on the employer, that makes the employer and the employee think, do we really want this? If you structure it right, I think you can go a long way towards saying, well, only the people who need this will even apply for for it. I think these are lessons that in other forms we've worked on, we've researched for a long time in any, not only in economic research on poverty and welfare programs, and that have taken much more center stage and much more prominence in the pandemic.
You set several conditions for how to make these programs function better and to decrease the bureaucracy. But I think one of the issues here was that the agencies needed different pieces of information from various other agencies because it's not connected, right? Because the data is not available in a central system. So they were relying on the applicants to provide them these pieces of information from different sources. To what extent do you think this is an issue, and to what extent does it work better in the US?
I think I can only answer the first the first question. I think that's a huge issue, right? Because if you rely on the applicant to provide information, you need the applicants to actually come up with that. And I don't know whether you had to supply any of the information to get exact records of my income. That takes a while. And I'm not going to do it while I'm very busy, I don't know, taking care of a kid, looking for a job, trying to work from home in between two quarantines, right? So in many ways, that means that you impose a cost on exactly the people who need most help. And anything you can do to reduce that is extremely valuable, right? So if you can check it more automatically, if you can gather the information from other sources, then that reduces the burden, not only on the applicant, but also on the agency, right? We know from a couple of contexts that social workers make a huge difference in terms of who gets aid and who doesn't get aid. And that's probably not good, right? Because it should be determined by the need of the applicant, and not by the ability of the social worker to fill in the missing pieces. So I think that's where we can do a lot. On the other hand, we know of plenty of negative examples of actually automating a system. It relies a lot on human interactions. It relies a lot on providing the information you have. So I don't think a completely automatic system would solve the problem. But certainly having more information, having more of the information supplied directly makes a lot of sense. It makes no sense that you have to go to your employer to check for data, bring it to the government that the government has in another part of the system, particularly since other people's employers may not be as ready as ours to quickly provide it.
It often comes down to the availability of data and having the information available readily. Do you see any progress or any changes in this respect? Possibly highlighted by the pandemic or pushed by the pandemic?
Actually, not much, but that doesn't mean it's not there. One reason for that is that attempts to improve the data sharing infrastructure take a long time. So maybe there is some benefit, and we'll see it in the long run. I think we've seen a lot of it in the health system. I'm not sure how that works over here. I remember that at the beginning of the pandemic in Germany, they were sending case numbers with a fax machine, and then had to redigitalize it. So there's scope for improvement. But I don't know whether we see it yet. I think in the health system we've seen a lot of these efforts to unify it, to streamline it. We now report statistics on it very well. I'm not aware of that in the welfare system. I have some hope for that happening because now you and I know of that problem. Right? How many of us have thought about the challenges someone who needs help and who seeks it faces in terms of just getting that help? Now a lot more of us have experienced that, so maybe we can improve it in the future, how difficult it is to get help if you're eligible for help. That was confined to a small number of people before, and so maybe now we'll do something about that. I hope so, especially here. I think the US has relied much more on existing systems, so the problem wasn't as salient there. But here we actually have the data, and we could use it for many purposes, to determine eligibility, to actually figure out how these programs work and who gets them.
You think we have the data here in the Czech Republic?
To a much larger extent than the US, and it's not only having the data; it's also the fact that it's much easier to connect it. People in the Czech Republic are uniquely identified by, I think, actually 3 numbers. Right? You have your insurance number, you have your birth number, and then you have your tax number, and all of them. So we have an excessive system of identifying people. You actually even have your permanent address, which uniquely identifies you unless you're a foreigner. Right?
The question is to what extent you can get to the data, right? Because there are legal issues which are making it more complicated. That's
much more, I think, the issue. And if I understand my colleague Philippe Perthold correctly, then this data sits in different places and it needs to be connected. That's a similar problem in the US. Plus, there you have the problem that even if you get it, you might not be able to connect it because there's no unique identifier. In the US, even before the pandemic, this is part of what I and my colleagues worked on. I think we've made a lot of progress towards data sharing between agencies. I think the standard here still is that you can ask another agency for data that they have. If you're I don't know, in the Ministry of Labor and you want to implement an unemployment insurance program, you could ask the Ministry of Social Affairs or whatever it is for the data. But the default would be that they're not obliged to give it to you. They can simply say no. And just changing that to a status quo where in principle you're obliged to provide that data, so no requires a justification, I think makes a huge difference. Right? At the moment, the situation is as follows. You sit at the other ministry and you think, what if something bad happens with that data? That's going to look bad for me because I said we can ship it out. Even if the default is just to say, no, you have to ship it out, then you can say that was part of my job. I had to ship it out, right? This is what should have happened, and I think that greatly facilitates it. I think we've seen, right, even before the pandemic, we have much more data than before. It's collected in decentralized manners, and we need a framework to put it all together and collect it and really make use of it.
That would be great. And in terms of, as you said, there were many government programs. Do you see any evaluation of the success of the programs here or in the US? Do you see them being assessed and some lessons learned for the future?
I think we do in the US. We have a lot of evaluations, or we have several evaluations. It's difficult in the short run, right? Particularly since we have a lot of other things to do. So first step is usually just to see who gets them. Did they prevent a drop in income? Did the people who were eligible take them up? I think that's traditionally being evaluated more in a place like the US that puts more emphasis on empirical research in policy. But I think we've seen IDEA do a couple of studies. There was a study on who received Kurzarbeit that they did. And even if these are not studies like academic papers who try to estimate causal effects of things, these are tremendously important. Right? One thing you can see from the study on Kurzarbeit is that a huge fraction of the money for Kurzarbeit went to large companies. Now, one of the few things, or one of the most solid things I think we know about Kurzarbeit is that it doesn't seem to work well for large firms. It's important for small firms who cannot fend off a huge shock, right? Whereas on the other hand, huge car manufacturers who make millions of dollars of profit and have huge cash reserves. They could have paid for that program, for the continued employment relationship themselves, right? I think that's the reason why it doesn't work well for big companies, because the ones that are doing well can deal with it themselves, and the ones that are not doing well, maybe there was a reason they didn't do that well. So these evaluations are important, right? You can think of it in a positive way, that this brought a lot of action to the idea of helping other people, to the idea of fending off poverty. So we tried a lot of new things, right? Now would be the time to look at them and think, what worked? What can we do better next time, in the hope that we won't have a next time like this, but we better be prepared next time, right? And what might work in normal situations, right? Which parts of these programs seem to have positive effects? You can see that in the US now, where there's a huge debate about things like the child tax credit, that was vastly expanded during the pandemic, and now we're talking about whether it should be permanent, how should it be permanent, how should it be structured. So I think we learned a lot about that from the pandemic, and that's why we should get the data and actually look at it and evaluate it to see what we can do better.
Perfect. I think with this we can finish. Thank you for being here, and thank you for all the interesting information you gave us. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot for having me.